Hello, I'm Chrissy Gale, and I'm your lead educator.
Hi there, I'm Jennifer Davidson, and I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Inspiring Children's Futures, based here at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, in Scotland. And we are absolutely delighted that you're joining us for this live streaming event. It's the first time we're streaming live where we're having questions as well, so please be prepared with sending in some questions, because we'd love to have a conversation with you about what some of your thoughts are and some of your questions might be about the topics that we've covered in the past 2 weeks since we've seen you last. So you may remember that we've talked through the topics of the necessity principle in more detail and what that really means for policy as well as for practice. We looked at the reasons, in particular, why children might be coming into care and the importance, especially, of prevention of family separation. We looked, as well as looking at the necessity principle, specifically we looked at 3 levels of prevention and how some children are particularly vulnerable to separation and being placed in care. It was great to see your comments on the topic of participation of children and young people in their decisions and decisions that are being made about them and their care decisions. And so that became a theme, I think, that's been running through the course over the last 2 weeks. And we also went back and we referred back to the topic of gatekeeping, and we looked a lot more specifically about that topic around the question of how we ensure that we're assessing properly the situation of children and their families. So that's a lot. That's 3 weeks of hard work. And today, Christy and I are going to be talking around some of these key topics. And we'll be discussing some of the comments that you've made, which have been so insightful and so interesting. And so as we do that, we really welcome your questions. And we'll work through these different steps together. And in particular, we want to really look at some of the questions around what does make it justifiable for a child to be coming into the care system. How do we make those decisions? How do we really effectively ensure prevention? And what does it mean really for a child to participate? And how do we understand how we do that well? And we've had an amazing group of people. And do you know that there are just about 5,000 of you who are participating around the world across at least 100 countries, and from a whole range of really interesting sort of professional contexts. We've got foster carers, we've got who else do we have, Chrissy? We've got
People in government departments, people who are working in policy, so a whole range of frontline practitioners as well, some social workers, some students who are hoping to become social workers.
Lovely. There's been really a broad range of you, and I think that broad range has been really evident in the comments that we've seen, hasn't it? And the really different viewpoints from different countries that have come in. And this is my plug number 1 of the entire of our entire sessions. Please say what country you're from when you say "in my country," because we're so interested in what's happening in your country. So thank you for sharing your views. There's been a lot of really interesting debate, and I think we're really keen to hear what your questions are in relation to some of these really key bits and pieces. So we'll explore that together. I think we're going to dive in just now with exploring with Chrissy particularly why that whole question about why children are taken into care in the first place and what makes it justifiable. It's a tricky question, Chrissy.
It is tricky, although I have to say that most people have overwhelmingly agreed with each other when it's recognised that actually poverty and social exclusion are the underlying causes, underlying reasons why children are coming into care. And again, you overwhelmingly agree with each other that this is unjustifiable reason, that actually just because a family is poor and struggling, a little bit like we're seeing in the Asha and Lan story, this is not a justifiable reason to place children in alternative care. There should be other recourses and support for families and family-based community resources available. I think that it's been very interesting, as Jennifer said, to hear the fact that this is what is happening in your countries, and that you actually don't think that, you know, that this should be addressed. So, for instance, what is a justifiable reason? Why should it be necessary for children to come into care? If it's not poverty, social exclusion, stigma discrimination, the issues we've covered in the last 2 weeks, you are agreeing that actually it should be about the safety of children and the fact that they're not put at risk. And if they're at risk of harm, and there has been a very thorough assessment to really understand that this is the case, then perhaps, yes, that might be a justifiable reason. And so David Anderson commented, it is the safety of each child that is paramount. and the evolving situation must be continually assessed to ensure needs are met and safety is ensured. And as I said, many of you actually agreed with that comment and similar. And again, also Alison Purdy is an example of some of the comments you've sent in, saying that in relation to decision making, it should be the safety and the well-being of the child that must dictate whether or not a child is placed in care. Those should be the principal reasons. What is best for the child is actually paramount. What has been interesting is that some of you have picked up on the fact, though, that why is it that children who come from less well-off socio-economic backgrounds are the ones that are coming into care? Because there is also recognition that actually there may be neglect, harm, and other treatment of children that are happening in all socio-economic levels of society. But I think there's also the comment that actually it's children who are in the lower socio-economic class of families, because they come to the notice of the administration, they come to the notice of the social workers, they come to the notice of other people in the community, and parents are for some reason classified as poor parents if they're poor, bad parents if they're poor parents. And as Celeste Berto noted, there is a social class aspect as well as a poverty aspect. It's children coming from lower income families that seem to come to the attention of authorities more than those from higher social status families. Beth Van Sloten, sorry Beth, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. I think you're from the Netherlands, and you also agreed with this, and you said it has much to do with the attitude of the frontline workers. Very often poor parents are considered not able to be part of a team around the child, where they often do have important things to say and contribute, and with the systems they could take care of their children and are willing to learn other ways of caregiving. I think those are very, very important observations. Another big issue that has come up, and of course we knew this would, is okay, if we understand that poverty and social exclusion, stigma discrimination are not justifiable reasons why children are coming into care, how can we address that? And of course resources are a big part of that. And many of you are saying, that's fine, but in my country, actually, we lack those resources. I mean, I actually think it is true for every country in the world. And of course, some countries have more resources than others, but we still never feel that social services, ministries of social affairs have the strength and the power and the resources that maybe some of the other bigger ministries like Ministry of Health, Ministry of Education get. So I think it's a very genuine concern. Diane Mora from Costa Rica wrote, in my country and in most Latin American countries, competent authorities do not have the resources, but most importantly, they do not have the approach of prevention. So the natural and less expensive response, they think, is to place a child in alternative care. So I think what's very important, what Diane has done there, sorry again for the pronunciation, is they have looked at two things. Yes, it can be a matter of resources, but it can also be a matter of attitude and perception and not a willingness to move resources from large residential facilities, for instance, actually to family-based care. And there is research, particularly across Eastern Europe, for instance. If you look at the UNICEF website for the CEE-CIS region, the Central and Eastern Europe region, there are documents that actually show assessments have been done, that setting up more suitable support at the beginning may be costly, but overall can be less costly and more cost effective than funding large residential institutions. So it's not just a matter of lack of resources, but it's actually where current resources go. Ana Barrera from South America also commented in the video in which Jeffrey Oyat spoke about primary prevention, and many of you really liked Jeffrey's video. She said, the idea I want to keep from the video is investment. So again, it's about resources. There are many and numerous reasons why a child or young person ends up in the care system, especially those who come from abusive environments. However, involvement in children and adolescents is also part of the state obligation, and investment is part of the state obligation. And in the general comment 19 from the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, it gives us a clear idea of what should investment be, and something that should always constantly be reviewed and revised. Rob from the Netherlands also wrote, justifiable reasons for alternative care could be any situation which endangers the best interest of the child. So there we have the issue of safety and security and being protected from risk of harm. He also raises the issue of judgment of risks, which we'll come on to a little bit more, but it also touches on gatekeeping and good assessment, and the quality and thoroughness of gatekeeping, he says. And that's also very often dependent on resources invested in professionalism, the morale of social workers and other care workers, the quality of their work and the quality of oversight, and the commitment to investing in good child protection and childcare systems. So he also raises another point, which I think we've just touched on, about why the investment in long-term institutionalization and not in family-based care, and that shift of attitudes, and trying to say prevention has to be upmost and foremost, and be the primary first step in the necessity principle. And it's about sometimes shifting resources. But most importantly, he also talks about ingrained traditions, attitudes, and that is something else that we've discussed quite a lot throughout the last 2 weeks. It is about practice, but it's also about what people think and the attitudes and ideas and the cultural context in which they work.
I think when we move into the next session, through the rest of the MOOC, we're going to be learning about the suitability principle as well. So we're going to be understanding, in contrast to large-scale institutions, it's prevention first, and then it's about more suitable accommodation, isn't it? So it's a whole range of different possibilities that we want to be emphasizing. Prevention starting with prevention.
And most definitely those are things we will go into much more in depth in the next 2 weeks, when we're going to talk about what people think is suitable care and what does suitable mean exactly, and where should resources be invested again. So exactly.
Was there anything of interest in particular in the comments about large-scale institutions or orphanages that you wanted to pick up on? Because I thought there was some interesting bits and pieces of reflection, actually really great learning that people were commenting on.
Absolutely. And I think particularly I picked up on a comment from Yvonne McCarty from Scotland. And why I think her comment was very relevant is because there is a misconception, or not a misconception, there's not a lot of knowledge about what is happening in other parts of the world. And she very much is happy that she's now learning from what is actually happening in other countries. And she said, again, of Jeffrey Oyat's video, she said, this was a really enlightening video, because I always thought an orphanage was for children who had lost their parents. And she said, well, I was wrong. And I think particularly in the UK, as we go around Europe, we do hear people, when we speak to them, saying, well, of course, all the children should be in orphanages because they're orphans. And we're able to say, and particularly relay your ideas and your comments and your experience, as well as previous research we've done, to say, well, actually, no, that's not the case. We don't have a lot of data, but we do have an understanding and knowledge that sometimes 95% of children upwards who are in orphanages are not orphans.
Indeed. And would you say, in terms of children who are orphans, true orphans who have neither parent living, that what are we looking at in terms of the UN guidelines and what it has to say about whether then in that case a large-scale institution would be appropriate?
Okay. The UN guidelines are consistently calling for the gradual closure of all large-scale residential institutions. And that's something we're going to discuss a lot in week 5 of this course. We're going to talk about what is an institution, because it's actually not clearly defined in the guidelines. And so there's been lots of debate and discussion around the world as to what is an institution, but most definitely the guidelines are clear on that. But what has been quite interesting, and I think it is another answer to your comment, your question, Jennifer, is what has been interesting for me is quite a lot of people have actually said, yes, we do think orphans is a justifiable reason for placing children in formal care, where actually the guidelines also recognise that informal care and kinship care in extended family, is a very, very important form of alternative care. So just because a child loses their parents, and again, we know around the world there's this debate of orphan. Is it the single parent loss or is it both parents? And different organisations have different definitions of this, which makes it a little bit difficult, I do admit. But if a child is orphaned and has no parents, then we're still not saying formal care is first and foremost the right answer. Very often, a lot of countries are also looking first and foremost at extended family.
Indeed. And that's what's happening around the world, isn't it? In many places.
Indeed. And in fact, I'd like to pose a question back to all of those of you participating in the course to think about over the coming weeks and how you might answer this question. So Mariana Muzzi has commented and she said, I don't believe death of parents is justifiable or a sufficient reason for formal alternative care arrangements, and certainly not enough reason for placing a child in residential care. In almost all cases, children are not alone, even in the sad event of their parents' death. Children usually have extended family, or the deceased parents have friends or some other adults who's willing to assume responsibility, either formally or informally. So I'd be very interested, in the light of the fact that some of you said yes, orphans, it is a justifiable reason for formal care, what you actually think about Mariana's comment on saying, actually, no, it's not a justifiable reason.
So while you're putting a question out to our viewers, I am going to take a question from Martin Hatton that comes through. So thank you, Martin. And Martin is asking about what assessment looks like. And so we've talked really to great depth, I think, about the importance in gatekeeping of a good assessment. And he's asking about what does it actually look like? So he's saying the example of a visit and then a meeting with an outcome to place a child into care. We don't know if anything was actually recorded in that decision. He's noted that he's had to place children without any paper assessment for over 8 years, except for his observation and the parents that and when the parents are insisting that he removes that child. In this situation, both children under the age of 3 years. So I think there's some really important pieces in that. Martin, we'd love to know what country your experience has been based in, because that's always useful to know as well. The question you're asking, I think, takes us into the question about, or the topic of decision making more widely. And when we're making decisions, what is the kind of information that we're drawing on? And what we know is it will always be subjective. And so we've got social workers who are, in some cases, trained to be thinking through different dimensions of a child's life and a family's life to make a decision that is informed by all of these things to determine what is in the child's best interest. But these are very difficult decisions, and we know that tools can be really effective at helping to shape our thinking about what those different domains might be as we're thinking about a child's life. But there have been questions, I think, that legitimately are asking, can you be entirely trained to do this? And I think those decisions that we make when we're informing whether a child should be removed from a family is influenced by a whole range of different aspects. I think what I'd like to focus on here for a moment is the question of participation. We've, of course, had that as our theme as well. And to what extent does participation inform the best interest, the decision about what the best interest is? And it was, we'll come on to participation a little bit later in our session this morning. But I think what I'd like to remind us is that at the conclusion of a decision that's being made on behalf of the child, it's in that child's best interest, that it is the decision that has been made by the system, the workers, the people that are assessing effectively. So that comes back to our question, Martin, about what is good assessment. And you're making a point about having it recorded. So very important that we're understanding what are the components of what has made that decision and what has informed that decision. Important to have that recorded, not least for the child when they've grown up, to understand as they're growing up, to understand why has that decision been made? Why did that child have to no longer live with their family? We hear from adults with care experience how important and how often that has been neglected, that to where children are not really, where we haven't explained carefully to children why a decision has been made. So for that reason, it's very important that we are clear about why, and that we have articulated that well to the children. And that's a step that cannot be missed if it's in the best interest of the child. That decision making has to include informing that child.
Maybe I could just add that there are different assessment tools being developed in different countries around the world. In the UK, for instance, in Scotland and also in England, but I don't know if there's actually, Jennifer will be able to answer this, there may be different tools, but definitely I know that the assessment tool is called the Common Assessment Framework. It's called CAF for short, but it's a very, very complex, quite detailed assessment, and it's definitely written down. So social workers, when they go and do several visits to fill in this assessment, have to then actually fill online a form. So it's quite complex. But we also gave you another example in the MOOC in the last 2 weeks of Hope and Homes in Rwanda, and they have developed a very contextually appropriate list of things that they think are very, very important to record and to observe to make those assessments. There are other examples. We purposely didn't put tools into the MOOC because there are so many, and we feel it's very, very important that they are contextually appropriate, that they match what is happening in the environment within the communities of those children. If you go onto the Better Care Network website, there may be some tools available on there. I'm not sure, and I will look it up for you. But most definitely that, yes, written down assessments. And the other thing I'd like to say about assessments is, I hope we highlighted it in the last 2 weeks of MOOC, is the importance of a multi-sectoral approach. So it's not just a social worker or a carer or whoever it may be in isolation making that decision, but so other people are involved. So for instance, we know in Moldova, there's a very good training going on to have health workers, education workers, accommodation workers, social workers, all training together on how to do assessments together. And they're also then developing their own assessment tools. So I think there's lots of different ways it can be done.
Thank you. A couple of the comments that have come through about making those decisions in relation to good assessments. One that I'd like to flag up is Maurice Sandoval, who's written, more than thinking in terms of justifiable or justifiable terms, I think we have to take the best interest as a key question. Is it in the best interest of the child or adolescent to be placed in alternative care? She says, I have known some cases where children by administrative or legal processes went to a residential care without deep social research, without any investigation into the family, I presume. And when a social worker finally knows the real context of the family, he or she might realize that the institutionalization could have been prevented if the family might have had access to some sort of service in advance. So I think that just reinforces our understanding of what could be prevented for children, how better choices could be made. I think many of you agreed the importance of family and community strengthening. Harvey Jones made the same comment about best interest of the child being critical. What this looks like might depend on the circumstances and the ability of change to happen or influence to happen within those circumstances. He says unnecessary placement is something that we all strive to ensure does not happen as we move forward in our roles. And that's certainly what our vision is for this MOOC, is to help equip people to make the best possible decisions. So he says family and community strengthening is a crucial opportunity for us to change the way things look, the way things are normally done, and to break the cycle of disadvantage, which I think takes us into a much wider understanding of society's culture. And many of you have agreed with all of that in terms of your comments as well. Daniel Galvan Galaviz from Mexico has written, the challenges are multi-problematic situations, and so the decisions are never easy or simple. And I thought that was a really great, a great reflection on these are really challenging and not black and white decisions.
Not at all. And I think that's where the subjectivity also comes in, and being trained as well to bring those two things together. So we have another question, again on this, on sort of assessments and decision making and the process in place to support this, and children's opinions being very crucial in this process. It's from LJ Noble. I'm sorry, I don't have your first name here. And you said, but judges do not seem to value the views of children. How can we change this? I can only speak from my personal experience of working around the world on issues of justice for children and having done some research into this. And I think it's a common issue. And I also have a personal colleague here who is quite an important family judge in England. He's one of the few judges who is very well known for actually really taking into consideration the views of children, and he thinks that's very important. But I think the answer is in training. We have to get child rights, the importance of child participation, the understanding of the situation of children into the training for the judiciary. And very often in a lot of countries, the judiciary, it's not just the judges, it's the people around them, the people advising them, the people working with them on assessments, or the guardians appointed by courts for children who also need that training. So a lot of judges say to us when we speak to them, it's very much based, when they talk about their colleagues, it's based at the moment on their own personal attitudes, their own personal understanding, and they do ask for more training.
There's some interesting developments happening in Scotland in relation to this very question about the way in which the judiciary are valuing the inputs really of children and young people, not just in decisions in relation to formal care, but more widely in terms of children's views in the court system. And it's become clear that while there has been some developments and movements, and I think this would probably be echoed across some other Western countries as well, there have been some improvements in the judiciary taking on board the views of children and young people, but predominantly it's young people over the age of 12 that the judiciary is more likely to gauge the views from. And in the context, for example, of perhaps contact in situations where there's been domestic violence, there's really important reasons, as there would be in many other contexts, that we listen to the views of children, even very young children, to try and elicit those views. And I think it's important to recognize that can be really challenging if people don't quite understand how to get the views of young people. And that takes us to some of the input that we talked about around participation. I don't know if you might want to move to this just now, Chrissy, where we talked a bit about through the session. It was a big theme of what our work was. Would you like to take us through a little bit about that? Because I think that's probably a nice link with what we said.
So I think, well, I don't think overwhelming. I think everyone who has commented absolutely agrees that participation is fundamental, and we're talking about full and meaningful participation, and a lot of you commented on the fact that it cannot be tokenism. If we're going to ask children and young people to participate in decision making, it has to be full, well informed, and meaningful. A few of you did feel though raised the challenges and thought some of them might be unsurmountable in cases where there were children with more severe forms of disability and learning challenges, or very young children, and also the cultural context of actually talking to children where it's not the norm is quite challenging. But however, a lot of you commented back and said, no, we do also believe that it doesn't matter, regardless of age, ability, maturity, they should be, it is a right, it is actually in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, it is a right that children can participate in decision making about their own lives. So perhaps Ashish Anthony, who wrote from India, answered this question, as others did. It said, it is very important to take the children's point of view, after all it is their life, but of course it is per their capacity, but we need to facilitate the participation process so they can take the best and most suitable options that they think is best for them. Sometimes we're in a hurry. We never give them the opportunity to be heard and to speak, and it's about taking that time and that effort. Laura Baxter also wrote, it's so vital children involved in the decision-making process, but it is recognised that their opinions can be expressed in other than verbal ways of communication. She suggested that children who are still not speaking or do not have speaking ability, there are other signs and cues and ways of getting that information that we must observe. Similarly, other factors such as family pressure or guilt must be considered too. It can be very difficult for children to really express what's happening to them, particularly if they're talking about their parents who they still love and care about, or they feel it's putting them in more danger. And so we must consider how we facilitate in a safe and careful manner. Amanda Mayman from New Zealand agrees it's definitely possible for children of any age and capacity to be involved in decision making. It's up to us as adults to understand and to be trained effectively how to hold those conversations or facilitate that process. Laura Evans is also from New Zealand, and she also says it's not simple, it's not easy. We do recognise that, and I think Emily Delat, when she spoke in her video, she recognises that, you know, it can be a very difficult process. We just have to be open to new ideas. But Laura particularly said we need to be able to listen with an open heart. And we've just done some research as Celsus and the University, Strathclyde and the Institute, looking at care leavers across Europe and asking them what was important about how participation in decision making was facilitated for them. And they brought up two things which Laura brings up. Trust. They have to feel that they are trusted and can trust the person that they're speaking to. But also they want somebody who listens to listen with a heart, to show that they care, so that the child is not just speaking to somebody who it's a process for them, but somebody who's really going to listen properly and act on their words, and to be patient. And Laura says this is always worthwhile.
And it strikes me that there's so much about the starting point in the individual worker of simply a commitment to want to know and a curiosity to really understand there's something really valuable in what that child is experiencing and has to say about their views about what decisions are being made. That's a fundamental commitment that starts. It's an orientation of and a mindset of that worker before a trust really can be developed.
And it comes back, as a lot of you said, to training as well. You know, the fact that we are not investing enough in training of people who are working with children.
Yeah.
And that's important. That's something again that we'll come to throughout the MOOC. But I think it's being raised much more than maybe we've even written it into the MOOC. This real importance of investing in skills, because people can only do their job if they're equipped to do it. And I think also Johnny Creighton from England made a very important point as well, that again he's the only one who really raised it, so I've brought it up, in that he does think participation is very important, but he said it shouldn't just be in a system, say a care system. It should be all children. It should be absolutely built into their lives, and we should be teaching children at school as early as possible, so it becomes a life skill. So children are absolutely understanding and accepting that they have a right to participate. And Isabella Matara said people who care after children need to create opportunities to help them being heard, but their opinions need to be valued. So it's not just about, as we said, listening. It's actually about valuing their opinions, taking them seriously, and then actually taking them into consideration when decisions are made. She said, now that's real participation.
That's really good. There's another question that's come through. So thanks for those of you that are participating, and thank you, Laura, who is LJ Noble, for your previous question. I'm gonna pick this up a little bit more now. So I believe this is still Laura asking, does the UN have any power on a macro level to force governments to move towards family-based care and away from institutional care? Do you think foreign donors are fueling the number of children's homes? That's a great question. Those are great questions. And in fact, if you could have given us some leading questions we would like you to give us, I think that's a really classic one. So I'm just going to respond to the first question. Okay. Yeah. And I think that the first is asking about the UN and their leverage in terms of making governments change. So I'm going to take us quickly back to our understanding of, we have the Convention on the Rights of the Child that all but one country has signed up to around the world, and there's a monitoring mechanism through the Committee on the Rights of the Child where countries are reporting to that committee about their progress on children's rights. The UN guidelines on alternative care for children are not a convention per se, they are guidelines. And that has been, I think there was some confusion in the comments in the first week, so it's just important to clarify. The Convention on the Rights of the Child is indeed an international convention and has some teeth within it, if you will, or some monitoring mechanisms. The guidelines are simply that, they're guidelines. However, we do think that they have some important advocacy power, and recognizing that these have been guidelines that have been welcomed unanimously by the General Assembly in 2009. These are guidelines that are important and have been owned by each country, and so as a result, they are what steers our thinking. So that having been said, we recognize that even where there are tools that dictate what the country should be doing for children, like the Convention on the Rights of the Child, that the gap between what we aspire to and what actually happens on the ground for children can be quite significant. And sometimes it's significant because of resources. Much of the time, it's also a number of other elements that can be changed. And so our aim is for a progression towards closing that implementation gap between what we ask and we recognize the rights of children to be and how they experience those rights in real life on a day-to-day basis. That is the power that the UN has in relation to changing the context for children. And I know that the committee regularly speaks to countries directly about the reduction of large-scale institutions and the growth of family-based care and the strengthening of that. So that prevention and the necessity principle is a regular feature of all countries' reports and the committee's response to countries about what they need to prioritize.
And in fact, we were speaking recently with the chair of the Committee on the Convention of the Rights of the Child. And of course, it's the committee who assess every country's court. Every 4 years, a country has to submit a report to the committee, and they're the ones that make comments on the reports. And Benjamin was saying that they take the UN guidelines very, very seriously into their consideration when they are assessing. So even though it's not a legal requirement or a requirement for them to do so, they do sit the UN guidelines alongside the convention when they are assessing countries. And they now sort of have almost a checklist, if you like, of what's in the UN guidelines that they use. So they do take it very, very, they see it as important and do take it very seriously.
And I think you can see that in the report, can't you?
Exactly, yeah. On the second question you've raised about foreign donors and funding the number of children's homes, this is a really interesting subject. It's one that others of you have commented on, actually. I think we will discuss it a lot more, and I hope we will have more discussion in week 5 around this issue on when we really talk a lot about deinstitutionalization. But I would say again from our research that definitely the perpetuation, the continuation of some children's homes institutions in some countries is because of the money that's coming in from overseas from different types of donors. And maybe we can talk a little bit more about that in week 5, and I will write some comments back in week 5 on this, because I think we have to be very careful about knowing which donors are doing which, and the fact there are some good donors with good money coming in to look at deinstitutionalization and better suitable care and prevention. But unfortunately, sometimes the message doesn't go out, just like we heard about in Scotland, not understanding that orphanages aren't for orphans. Also, there's some understanding amongst personal givers that actually the best thing is for these children and aren't understanding the situation on the ground. So I think we've got a lot of advocacy and public work to do on addressing and on addressing that issue and giving people more knowledge so they can make informed decisions about how they give money.
Great. So tune in and stay tuned in terms of that topic. It's a really, really key question. So thank you to Laura for that. So I'm mindful that our time is running out, and I don't want to finish up without talking about Asha and Lan's story.
Yeah, okay, that's good. And we just need to go back a little bit to tertiary prevention on the end.
Okay,
great.
So some great responses to you by all of you about the Asha and Lan story. It's I think we were really upset. Some of you were really upset to just have seen the circumstances and the way in which that social worker was engaging with that family. So you were really fantastic in your comments. And if you haven't looked at the comments for that Asha and Lan story recently, it's well worth going back, because actually it draws out a whole range of different elements of what was wrong in that story. So what the social worker really ought to have done. So she made no attempt to fully assess the situation of Asha and Lan and their parents. She didn't speak to Asha and Lan to involve them in any of the decision making. You also noted that the social worker really lacked compassion and had a very unhelpful attitude. She had no information about foster parents. She was splitting up siblings. And many of you commented on her unprofessional approach and behavior. You spoke about how resources could have been moved from the care settings to support the family, as it was obviously a loving and caring family. I think you'll recognize that this was an exaggerated caricature to make a point about the things that really ought not to happen when social workers are engaged in families. I think what I need to say is really to be clear that We recognize there are fantastic social workers that are working out there, and as we stay tuned in terms of the rest of the story, I'm hopeful that we can help us to see how exaggerated that caricature actually is, because we know that there are some really important, excellent workers that are doing some really important work. And so please don't be offended if you feel that we're saying that social workers don't do good work. Of course, there will be some who aren't. I think what I'd like to say as a social worker myself, that it's really important to recognize the resources in the wider context that social workers are working in, the understanding of the training, to understand the level of support perhaps those workers are getting, the workloads and what's actually achievable, as well as the response of the wider system to supporting the decisions and the work of social workers. So we can't lose sight of what social workers are doing. We can't lose sight of that wider context in which they're working. There's some great comments from you. I won't go into detail because I know that we're coming to near the end of our time. And we just want to touch on the 3 levels of prevention that was so important to take a quick look at.
So I just wanted to react to some of your comments and questions, particularly about tertiary prevention. And some people asking a little bit more about really getting a more clear idea about what tertiary prevention is. So I think everybody recognises that primary prevention is really across the board for all children, to make sure that their families don't get into difficulty. Secondary prevention is much more targeted when we realise there are some families that are at higher risk and the vulnerability of becoming separated. But tertiary prevention is very much about making sure that if a child has gone into care, that when they go back to their families, everything is done for reintegration back into their families. And that when they go back into their families, everything is put in place so that the child does not have to go back into care a second or a third time. So tertiary prevention is really at that level of starting once a child enters care to making sure they can safely go back home and remain there.
That's helpful because there was a bit of confusion.
Yeah, there was.
You know, the comment that about stigma and discrimination, that whole piece, I wanted to maybe just bring in a thought just about that. It was interesting in Galina, her example about in Bulgaria about the Roma community and the way in which discrimination against the Roma community has an impact on the disproportionate nature of how many Roma children are taken into formal care, and that overrepresentation element. There was a further comment from Murgo Ray from Australia, who was commenting on the experience in South Australia and of Aboriginal children by telling us about the disproportionate and overrepresentation of Aboriginal children in the formal care system as well, and the indication of how important it is that we are supporting First Nations families and communities to be able to care well for their children, but also recognizing, I think, I'd like to add to that, and bringing back in the Bulgarian example in Galina, that we need to recognize our own professional biases and discrimination that we might hold as part of a cultural context in which we may then be making decisions in our assessments that aren't well tested and that might be informed by a view of discrimination about what we think about Roma people, what we think about Aboriginal people, what we think about poor people, as you were mentioning earlier, disabled children, all sorts of views that we might hold. And I think one of the important elements about making decisions and the multi-agency aspect of assessments is about having others who have different views, who can test out and question the decisions that social workers are making in that context of removing a child. But I think stigma and discrimination is a really, really important element for us to be thinking about, because we can't feel comfortable about overrepresentation of certain populations if we don't understand why that's happening.
So I'd like to close off this conversation by saying thank you so much for participating and joining us today. Thank you for working through the course. It's great to hear the comments that you're enjoying it, but also what's really rewarding for us is to hear how some of you are saying you're going to take it into your own everyday practice. And for us, that's really fantastic, because that's what this course is all about, and how we can support you and help you in your everyday work. So please keep those comments coming. Please keep the discussions going. Please, as Jennifer said, when you say in my country this happens, please tell us which country, because that's really exciting and interesting for us. Next week, we're going to move on to the suitability principle, and we're going to spend 2 weeks discussing the suitability principle and what is suitable care. But also, please remember, or please remind your colleagues and friends that actually they can still join up for the course. Even though we're about to go into week 4, they can still start at week 1. They can join us and there are 4 weeks after the course closes for them to complete. So we'd love to have more people join us and to be able to share in this amazing discussion and the commenting that's going backwards and forwards. So again, a huge thank you to everybody.
And thank you to those of you who sent us in some questions, which was just great to have you participating in our conversation. So all the best for the week ahead, and we hope you enjoy the week. Thank you.